Imagine you're driving alone on a quiet country road in the middle of the night. Your car slides off into a ditch, but you're not panicked. You've got your phone and you know you can call someone to help. You're talking to your parents step by step, guiding them to your location. And then, out of nowhere, the call cuts off. You vanish into the night without a trace, leaving behind nothing but an echo of your last words. This is the haunting reality of Brandon Swanson's disappearance. Brandon Swanson was a 19-year-old from Minnesota, a typical young adult with dreams, friends, and family. On the night of May 14th, 2008, after attending a small gathering, he found himself driving back home, a drive he had made countless times before. But this time, something went terribly wrong. His car veered off the road into a ditch. In a situation most would find nerve-wracking, Brandon remained calm. He called his parents, confident they would help him find his way. For nearly an hour, Brandon stayed on the phone with his parents, giving them directions, reassuring them that he was walking toward a familiar town. But the frustrating truth was that he wasn't where he thought he was. His parents drove to where he said he'd be only to find nothing. No car, no Brandon. The last thing his parents heard before the call abruptly ended was a short, cryptic phrase, "Oh shit." That was the last time anyone heard from Brandon Swanson. In this podcast, we'll dive into the unsettling mystery of his disappearance. We'll unravel the details of that fateful night, explore the theories that surround his case, and confront the unsettling truth that after years of searching, Brandon has never been found. What happened to Brandon Swanson? Why did he vanish without a trace? And could there be something more to this case than a simple accident? Stay with me as we embark on this investigation, piecing together the evidence and trying to uncover the truth behind one of the most mysterious disappearances in recent history. It was a typical spring evening on May 14th, 2008, and Brandon Swanson was just like any 19-year-old enjoying life and spending time with friends. That evening, he had attended a small gathering in Canby, Minnesota, where he was studying at the local community college. Nothing about that night seemed unusual. There was no tension, no arguments, no reason to believe that this night would end any differently than any other. As the clock ticked past midnight and into the early hours of May 15th, Brandon left the gathering, got into his car, and began what should have been a straightforward drive home to Marshall, a town about 30 minutes away. It was a route he was familiar with, one he had driven many times before. Yet, for reasons still unclear, things took an unexpected turn. At some point during the drive, Brandon's car left the road. Whether it was due to misjudgment, fatigue, or an unfamiliar stretch of road, no one knows for sure. His car ended up stuck in a ditch near the town of Porter, miles away from where he believed he was. But even then, Brandon remained calm. His phone was his lifeline, and he knew exactly who to call. At 1:30 in the morning, Brandon called his parents. He explained to them that his car had gone off the road, but assured them that he was fine. He didn't seem panicked, just frustrated that his car was stuck and that he needed their help to get home. In a calm, rational voice, he told them he was going to start walking toward the nearby town of Lind and directed them to meet him there. What unfolded next would mark the beginning of a long and painful mystery. His parents, Brian and Annette, got into their car and drove out to find him, following the directions Brandon gave over the phone. Yet, when they arrived at the location he described, they found nothing. No Brandon, no car. They kept speaking with him on the phone, trying to coordinate where they were. Frustration grew on both sides as it became clear they weren't in the same place, despite both believing they were close by. Brandon, still walking and determined to reach town, kept reassuring his parents, but the night was growing darker, colder, and more confusing. He continued walking, the sound of gravel beneath his feet and the wind in the distance. Then came the moment that would haunt his parents forever, a sudden change in his voice. His last words before the phone call cut off were an ominous "oh shit." And just like that, silence. From that moment, Brandon Swanson vanished, leaving behind only questions. Where was he walking? What had he seen or encountered that led him to exclaim in alarm? And how could someone simply disappear in the middle of a phone call with their parents with no trace left behind? The search was just beginning, but for Brandon's family, it was the start of an agonizing journey that would lead to more questions than answers. 47 minutes. That's how long Brandon Swanson stayed on the phone with his parents on the night. He disappeared a length of time that should have been enough to find him, but instead it became a puzzle no one could solve. This phone call, filled with frustration, confusion, and growing desperation, would be the last time anyone ever heard from him. At around 1:30 in the morning, Brandon called his parents after his car got stuck in a ditch. From the start, the tone of the conversation was calm, but with a clear sense of urgency. Brandon wasn't panicked, but there was frustration in his voice, the kind that comes from being stranded in an unfamiliar place. He believed he was near Lind, a small town not far from his home in Marshall, and he asked his parents to come pick him up. As they drove out, Brandon stayed on the phone, trying to guide them to where he thought he was. He described landmarks, road conditions, and his surroundings in an attempt to help them pinpoint his location. The conversations were practical at first. He was just a young man trying to get home. But the longer the call went on, the more clear it became that something wasn't right. His parents, Brian and Annette, followed his directions carefully, but when they reached the area he had described, Brandon wasn't there. He insisted he was near Lind, but his parents could see no sign of him or his car. They double checked their location, driving up and down the roads, growing more confused by the minute. The frustration on both sides began to mount. Brandon couldn't understand why they couldn't find him, and his parents couldn't figure out where he actually was. There's a unique kind of tension that builds in situations like this. For Brandon, the urgency was intensifying. He had been out there for a while, walking in the dark along what he thought was a gravel road surrounded by vast fields and farmland. His parents, on the other end, were growing increasingly anxious. They knew something was off. How could they not be in the same place when Brandon's directions were so clear? As the minutes stretched on, Brandon continued to provide more information. He mentioned seeing lights in the distance, believing they were from the town of Lind. His parents drove toward the lights, hoping it would bring them closer to him, but again they found nothing. At this point, the emotional toll of the call was becoming heavier. Brandon's voice, while composed, carried an edge of frustration. His parents, although trying to remain calm, couldn't shake the growing fear that something was terribly wrong. Throughout the call, Brandon's focus remained on getting home. He reassured his parents that he was walking toward town, staying on what he believed was the right path. But as the conversation neared the 47-minute mark, the tension in the air was palpable. Then came the final moment that has haunted everyone involved, a sudden shift in Brandon's voice as he exclaimed, "Oh shit." It was the last thing his parents ever heard from him. The call abruptly ended after that. His parents tried to call him back, but the phone rang out no answer. They called again, desperately hoping he would pick up, but each time the result was the same: silence. That moment, that sudden exclamation, left everyone asking the same question. What did Brandon see or hear that made him react with such alarm? Was it something in the landscape, a dangerous misstep, or something more sinister? It was as though he had vanished into thin air, leaving nothing behind but a cold trail of unanswered questions. 47 minutes may seem like a long time, but in this case, it felt like nothing at all. What should have been a straightforward rescue turned into the beginning of an agonizing mystery, one that would only deepen as the days turned into weeks and weeks into years. From the very beginning of Brandon Swanson's disappearance, one thing was clear: he wasn't where he thought he was. For 47 minutes, Brandon had insisted he was near the small town of Lind, guiding his parents through what he believed was the correct location. He was sure he was walking toward recognizable landmarks, moving confidently toward safety. But as the investigation would soon reveal, Brandon's actual location was nowhere near where he believed himself to be. The day after Brandon went missing, authorities began their search for any sign of him. His parents had been looking for him around Lind, but the police would soon make a startling discovery. Brandon's car wasn't near Lind at all. In fact, it had been found almost 25 miles away, in a ditch off a gravel road near the town of Porter, a completely different direction. This realization shifted the entire investigation and opened up a troubling question. How had Brandon been so far off from his actual location? To understand the confusion, we have to look at the conditions of that night. Brandon was driving in the rural backroads of Minnesota, an area marked by long stretches of flat farmland with few distinguishing features. The night was pitch black, and in a place with little light pollution, it would have been almost impossible to see much of anything beyond a few feet in front of him. It's easy to imagine how Brandon, once out of his car and walking in the dark, could have become disoriented. But this wasn't just about the landscape.
It was also about human perception. People often believe they can retrace their steps or estimate their surroundings based on memory or instinct, but in situations like this, disorientation can creep in unnoticed. Brandon had been so confident that he was near Lind, but in reality, he had driven far off course, possibly taking a wrong turn or misjudging the roads. The fact that his car was found near Porter suggests that something had gone wrong much earlier in his journey home.
This raises the question: did Brandon realize he was lost? If he did, he never said so. He maintained his belief that he was heading toward Lind, relying on the lights he could see in the distance. But those lights weren't from Lind. Instead, they were likely from farmhouses or other distant sources in the area around Porter. The more he walked, the further he strayed from his actual location, and the more frustrated he became as his parents couldn't find him. Brandon's disorientation could also have been compounded by the stress of the situation. Although he remained calm on the phone, the growing frustration and confusion would have taken a toll on anyone. As the minutes ticked by and he continued walking without reaching the town he expected to find, it's possible that his sense of direction began to falter further. It's important to consider the possibility that Brandon may not have been familiar with this exact stretch of road. While he had likely driven similar routes many times before, rural areas can be deceiving in the dark. It's easy to miss a turn or take the wrong road, especially if you're tired or slightly distracted. What started as a minor detour may have quickly escalated into a much bigger problem once he was on foot, with little more than his phone and the sound of his parents' voices guiding him through the darkness. The confusion over Brandon's location is one of the central mysteries of this case. How could a young man, confident in his ability to navigate, end up so far from where he believed he was? It's a haunting thought, the idea that you can be so sure of your surroundings, yet be completely mistaken. And as the investigation continued, the question of where Brandon really was that night became even more crucial to understanding what might have happened to him after his final words were heard. In a case full of unanswered questions, the mystery of Brandon's location is perhaps the most troubling. It suggests that the final moments of his phone call were even more disorienting than anyone realized, leaving investigators with a vast, dark landscape to search and only the faintest clues to guide them. The morning of May 15th, 2008 dawned with a lingering sense of unease for Brandon's parents. They had spent the night searching for him, desperately driving the rural roads of Minnesota, hoping to find any sign of their son after that chilling final moment of silence on the phone. With no answers and Brandon still missing, they turned to the authorities for help. When Brian and Annette Swanson reported their son missing to the local police, they expected an immediate and robust response, but instead they were met with a frustrating delay. In cases like Brandon's, the authorities often hesitate to treat an adult's disappearance with the same urgency as they would a child's. The reasoning behind this is simple: adults have the right to go missing if they choose. At 19 years old, Brandon was legally an adult, and the initial assumption by law enforcement was that he may have simply wandered off or was staying with friends. For the Swansons, however, this was not just an issue of a young man taking some time for himself. Brandon had been on the phone with them for nearly an hour, clearly disoriented but adamant that he was trying to find his way home. And then, in the middle of their call, something had happened, something serious enough for him to exclaim, "Oh shit," before the line went dead. This wasn't a case of a young adult going off the grid for a few days. This was something far more troubling. The initial police response was lukewarm at best. It wasn't until later that day, when Brandon still hadn't surfaced, that authorities began to take the situation more seriously. By then, the critical window of time, the hours immediately after someone goes missing, had already passed. Nonetheless, search efforts finally commenced, focusing on the area near Porter where Brandon's car had been found. The police, alongside search teams and volunteers, combed the roads and fields looking for any trace of the young man. As the search began in earnest, early theories about what might have happened to Brandon started to emerge. The most basic theory was that Brandon had simply gotten lost. It was a dark, rural night, and the landscape was vast and disorienting. The possibility that he had wandered too far off course and gotten turned around seemed reasonable at first. After all, he had been walking along what he thought was a gravel road, convinced that he was heading toward Lind, but the reality was that he was miles away. Perhaps in the darkness he had become so confused that he simply kept walking in the wrong direction, losing his bearings entirely. The theory of disorientation was supported by the rural terrain itself. The area around Porter is characterized by flat farmland, dotted with occasional creeks, fields, and gravel roads. In the pitch black night, with no streetlights or familiar landmarks, even someone who knew the area could easily lose their way. Brandon may have believed he was walking toward town, but he could have unknowingly walked deeper into the countryside instead. Another early theory considered the possibility that Brandon had fallen into the nearby Yellow Medicine River, which runs through the area. It wasn't an outlandish idea. Rural rivers, especially at night, can be deceptive. The banks are often hard to see, and a fall into the water could quickly turn dangerous, especially if the current was strong enough to sweep someone away. While this theory didn't immediately gain traction, it remained a possibility as search teams explored the surrounding areas. Despite these early theories, nothing about the case was straightforward. There was no physical evidence to suggest a struggle, no signs that Brandon had been injured, and no immediate clues that pointed to foul play. The idea that he had simply gotten lost seemed plausible, but with each passing day, the lack of any solid leads made that theory harder to believe. If he had gotten lost, surely by now they would have found some trace of him: footprints, an article of clothing, or even his phone. But the fields and roads turned up nothing. For the Swanson family, the slow start to the search and the initial theories offered little comfort. They knew Brandon, and they knew he wouldn't just disappear. Something more had happened that night, but in those early days, no one could say what. The only certainty was that time was slipping away, and the more time passed, the less likely it seemed that Brandon had simply wandered off. As the search intensified, authorities began to question whether the initial theories were enough. Could Brandon have met with an accident? Had something or someone else crossed his path that night? The questions multiplied, but the answers remained elusive. What began as a missing persons case now teetered on the edge of a deeper mystery, one that would take years to unravel, and even then, no one could say for sure what had happened to Brandon Swanson. The first concrete clue in the search for Brandon Swanson came when authorities discovered his car. It was located in a ditch off a gravel road near the small town of Taunton, Minnesota, miles away from where he believed himself to be. The discovery of the car raised a host of new questions, none of which brought the investigation any closer to understanding what had happened that night. Brandon's car had gone off the road, but there were no signs of a struggle, no damage to the vehicle beyond the fact that it was stuck. The doors were locked, the keys were missing, and there was nothing inside the car to suggest foul play. It seemed as though Brandon had simply walked away from the scene in search of help. But the burning question remained, where had he gone? This lack of evidence left investigators grappling with an unsettling mystery. If there had been some sort of altercation, or if someone else had been involved in his disappearance, there should have been signs of broken window, a scuffle, or even traces of Brandon's belongings. But there was nothing. His car was eerily pristine, as if it had just rolled into the ditch and been abandoned. It seemed increasingly likely that Brandon had, as he told his parents over the phone, decided to leave the car and walk toward what he believed was safety. But the troubling part was the location of the car. It was so far from where Brandon thought he was, and the nearby town of Porter was still miles from Taunton. The idea that he had been walking toward Lind as he had believed made little sense now. The location of his car complicated the search even further. If he wasn't near Lind and his car was stuck near Taunton, where exactly had Brandon been walking when his final words were heard? Investigators, already stretched thin by the scope of the search, began to shift their focus. They followed the logical assumption that Brandon had walked from his car in search of help, but to where? The fields and gravel roads around the area were vast and unforgiving, making it nearly impossible to determine his exact path. No footprints were found, no discarded items, nothing that could give them a clear direction. Despite this, one thing seemed clear. Brandon had walked away from his car with every intention of reaching town. He hadn't been panicked, according to the phone call with his parents, and he believed he knew where he was going. But his sense of direction had been so far off that the discovery of his car only deepened the mystery. The rural landscape of southwestern Minnesota, where Brandon Swanson disappeared, is a place that, during the day, might seem peaceful and even picturesque, but at night, the same setting transforms into a vast, disorienting maze of tall grass, uneven terrain, and shadowy rivers where even someone familiar with the area could easily lose their bearings. For Brandon, walking alone in the middle of the night with nothing but his phone, this landscape became an almost insurmountable obstacle. The area where Brandon's car was found, near Taunton, is typical of rural Minnesota. Flat fields stretch endlessly, often broken only by gravel roads, ditches, and occasional farmhouses. The fields themselves, covered in tall grass and crops, offer little in the way of landmarks. The night of May 14th into the early hours of May 15th was particularly dark, with no moonlight to help illuminate the way. Without streetlights and with very little traffic, it would have been almost impossible for Brandon to see more than a few feet in front of him. The terrain around the car was likely uneven, with rough patches of gravel, hidden dips in the fields, and creeks or small streams running through the land. Brandon, who believed he was walking toward Lind, was actually in a much more challenging environment than he realized. Walking in the dark on an unlit road, surrounded by nothing but endless fields, must have been both physically exhausting and mentally disorienting. Each step forward could have led him further away from his intended destination, and in the vast emptiness of the landscape, it's easy to see how his sense of direction might have failed him. The tall grass surrounding the roads would have only added to his confusion. In some areas, the grass could have grown high enough to obscure his view of the road or any potential landmarks. His phone, his only lifeline to his parents, was no substitute for being able to actually see where he was headed. The assumption that the lights in the distance were from the town of Lind likely came from his desperation to find some sort of recognizable landmark, but in reality, those lights could have come from a distant farmhouse or even a reflection off a building in another direction entirely. The weather conditions that night were not extreme, which was a small mercy in an otherwise difficult situation. There was no rain, no severe cold, and the temperatures hovered around a comfortable level. But what made that night particularly challenging was the lack of visibility. On a moonless night in rural Minnesota, without even a glow from nearby towns, the blackness can be overwhelming. For someone like Brandon, walking through this environment would have been more than just disorienting, it could have felt like walking through a void. And in that void, there were hazards. Small streams or rivers crisscrossed the area, with one in particular standing out, the Yellow Medicine River, which became a focal point in the search for Brandon. In the dark, even a slight misstep near one of these waterways could turn deadly. A sudden drop into cold water or a misjudged step into a hidden ditch could lead to disaster. It's this very river and the possibility that Brandon may have fallen into it that became one of the most debated theories in the case. The landscape that Brandon Swanson walked through on the night of his disappearance was unforgiving. It was a place where distance is deceptive, where familiar roads turn into unmarked paths, and where a young man, already lost, could quickly find himself in more danger than he realized. Each step into the dark led him further into the unknown, and with every passing moment, the likelihood of finding him diminished, lost in the vast rural heart of Minnesota, swallowed by the night. Brandon Swanson's belief that he was walking toward the town of Lind was central to his final phone call with his parents. Throughout their 47-minute conversation, Brandon was sure he knew where he was going. But as we've already seen, he was nowhere near Lind. The question then becomes, why was he so certain he was headed there? And more importantly, where was he actually going? To understand this, we need to consider Brandon's mindset that night. After his car became stuck in a ditch, he likely felt a sense of urgency, not panic, but a need to resolve the situation and get home. He was young and confident, and he had lived in the area for years, making the assumption that he knew the landscape and the roads well. But as we know, familiarity can sometimes lead to overconfidence. The rural backroads of Minnesota, especially at night, are deceptive. A road you think you know can turn into something entirely different when landmarks are obscured by darkness. Brandon believed he was walking toward Lind because it was the nearest town he could think of, and his instinct likely told him that was the direction to take. Lind was only a few miles from his home, and in the dark, any light in the distance could easily have been mistaken for the town's lights. He may have also been relying on his memory of the area, thinking he recognized certain features of the landscape, but in reality, he was heading deeper into the countryside, away from both his car and any town. There's also the possibility that Brandon was trying to reach a specific location, perhaps a landmark he knew well, like a particular building, a road junction, or a farmstead he'd visited before. It's likely that he wasn't just wandering aimlessly. He had a destination in mind, even if that destination was based on a misunderstanding of where he actually was. But as the minutes ticked by and his parents still couldn't find him, it's possible that his certainty began to waver. Was he still heading in the right direction, or had he made a mistake? This potential doubt may have added a layer of frustration to his already difficult situation. Brandon's mindset that night was likely one of determination mixed with growing confusion. He was focused on getting to safety, but the deeper he walked into the dark, the more disoriented he may have become. His certainty that he was near Lind never faltered, even when the evidence his parents not finding him. His inability to spot familiar landmarks suggested otherwise. It's possible that he clung to this belief because it was his only hope of getting home. To admit that he was lost, completely lost, would have been terrifying. In any missing persons case, there are moments that haunt investigators and families alike, moments that could hold the key to the entire mystery. For Brandon Swanson's family, that moment came when, just before the phone call with his parents cut off, Brandon suddenly said, "Oh shit." Those two words have sparked countless theories about what might have happened in the seconds before he vanished. What could Brandon have seen or encountered that caused such a reaction? Theories range from the mundane to the terrifying. One possibility is that he stumbled into some sort of physical hazard. Given the uneven terrain and the nearby Yellow Medicine River, it's conceivable that Brandon might have suddenly lost his footing, stepping into water or tripping over something hidden in the tall grass. His exclamation may have been the result of a sudden slip or fall, perhaps into the river or down an embankment. In this scenario, the oh shit moment is one of realization that he had made a dangerous misstep. But there are other, more unsettling possibilities. What if Brandon had encountered someone or something unexpected? The rural areas of Minnesota aren't entirely uninhabited, and it's possible that he crossed paths with a person or animal that startled him. In the dark, even a harmless encounter with a deer or other wildlife could have been alarming. There's also the chance, however remote, that someone else was out there in the fields that night, another person, perhaps even someone with ill intent. Though there is no evidence of foul play, the fact that Brandon's final words were spoken in a tone of alarm has left room for darker theories to emerge. There's also the possibility that Brandon's exclamation was in response to something in the landscape, a sudden drop off, a riverbank, or even the realization that he was more lost than he had originally thought. The way he said, "oh shit," has been analyzed and dissected, with some believing it indicated immediate danger, while others think it was simply an expression of frustration. But whatever it was, those words marked the last time anyone heard from Brandon. His phone call ended abruptly, as if he had been cut off in mid step, leaving the question of what happened in those final moments hanging in the air. One of the most persistent theories in Brandon Swanson's case is the possibility that he may have fallen into the Yellow Medicine River, a body of water that runs near where his car was found. The river isn't particularly wide or deep, but it's unpredictable, with certain areas prone to strong currents and hidden drop offs. Could Brandon have walked into the river in the dark, unknowingly stepping into danger? Search teams, recognizing this possibility early on, focused much of their efforts on the river. Divers were brought in, and the water was thoroughly searched, both immediately after his disappearance and in the weeks that followed. Sonar equipment was used to scan the riverbed, and cadaver dogs were brought in to help detect any sign of human remains. Despite these extensive efforts, no trace of Brandon was ever found in the Yellow Medicine River, leaving investigators to question whether he had ever entered the water at all. The river theory holds weight because of the landscape Brandon was walking through. In the dark, it would have been easy for him to miss the riverbank, especially if the area around it was overgrown. A single misstep could have led him into the water, where the current might have carried him downstream before he could react. If this had happened, the river's currents could have made it difficult to locate his body, especially in the days immediately following his disappearance. However, given the thoroughness of the search, it seems increasingly unlikely that he ended up in the river. Despite the extensive search efforts, the lack of evidence in the river has left the theory open to debate. Some believe that if Brandon had fallen in, his body would have been found by now. Others suggest that certain areas of the river are difficult to search and that it's still possible he was swept away by the current. However, as time went on and no evidence emerged from the river, investigators began to explore other possibilities. The theory of Brandon falling into the Yellow Medicine River remains just that, a theory. It's one of the more plausible explanations for what could have happened to him, but the lack of any conclusive evidence has left it shrouded in uncertainty. Like so much in this case, the river remains both a potential answer and a dead end, leaving those searching for Brandon to wonder whether the truth lies in the water or somewhere else entirely. One of the most chilling possibilities in Brandon Swanson's disappearance is the notion that foul play could have been involved. Although there has been no direct evidence to suggest that Brandon encountered someone with malicious intent that night, some investigators and theorists haven't ruled out this darker explanation. In cases like this, where a person vanishes without a trace, the question of foul play always lingers just beneath the surface. The idea that Brandon may have crossed paths with someone who meant him harm is difficult to ignore. After all, he was walking alone on rural backroads in the dead of night. It's possible, though unlikely, that someone else was out there, a local resident, a passerby, or even someone who was intentionally in the area for nefarious reasons. Rural areas like the one Brandon disappeared in are typically quiet, but that very isolation could also provide cover for someone looking to commit a crime without being seen. Yet, the possibility of foul play is complicated by the lack of any physical evidence suggesting a struggle or abduction. Brandon's car, found in the ditch near Taunton, showed no signs of damage or forced entry. There were no marks on the ground indicating a fight, no personal belongings scattered nearby. It seemed as though Brandon had simply left the car of his own accord without any external interference. His calm demeanor during the phone call with his parents further suggests that, at least initially, he didn't feel threatened by anyone or anything. Additionally, the area where Brandon disappeared was sparsely populated, making it less likely that he would have encountered someone by chance. Authorities looked into local residents and investigated whether there were any known suspicious individuals or criminal activity in the area at the time of his disappearance, but nothing of note came up. There were no reports of strangers in the area, no sightings of suspicious vehicles, and no known criminals operating in that region. It's as if Brandon had walked into the night and disappeared on his own without interference from anyone else. Despite the lack of evidence pointing to foul play, the possibility can't be completely dismissed. Sometimes, in the most mysterious of cases, the absence of evidence can be as troubling as its presence. Could Brandon have met someone who harmed him after that final, cryptic, "oh shit"? Or could something more sinister have occurred that night, with Brandon being taken by someone after the phone call had ended? These are questions that remain unanswered, leaving investigators and those following the case with a lingering sense of unease. Search dogs were a key part of the effort to locate Brandon Swanson in the days following his disappearance, and what they uncovered, or rather, what they didn't uncover, added yet another layer of complexity to the case. Trained dogs can often trace the scent of a missing person over large distances, and in Brandon's case, they were deployed to follow his trail from the area where his car was found. The dogs were able to pick up Brandon's scent fairly quickly, leading investigators to believe that he had indeed walked away from his car just as he had described to his parents over the phone. The trail led along a gravel road consistent with the location where his car was discovered. The dogs followed his scent for some distance, giving investigators hope that they might be able to retrace his steps and discover what had happened. However, as the dogs neared the Yellow Medicine River, something puzzling occurred. The scent trail suddenly stopped. The dogs, which had been so reliable up to this point, were no longer able to follow Brandon's scent beyond that point. This development fueled speculation that Brandon may have fallen into the river, with the water potentially washing away his scent and preventing the dogs from continuing their search. The sudden disappearance of his scent near the river was a key reason why investigators spent so much time focusing on that area in the search for his body. But there's another, more perplexing possibility. The fact that the dogs lost his scent could also suggest that something else had happened to Brandon at that location. It could indicate that he had been picked up by someone in a vehicle, which would explain why the dogs were no longer able to follow his trail. This theory, while speculative, is consistent with the idea of foul play or even a well-intentioned passerby who unknowingly became part of the mystery. Whatever the reason, the abrupt end of the dog's trail near the river remains one of the most confounding aspects of the case. It suggested that Brandon had been walking along the road for some time before either reaching water or encountering an unknown factor that caused his trail to disappear. But without further clues, investigators were left wondering had Brandon drowned or had something more unexpected occurred at that spot. As with many cases involving young adults, the question of alcohol consumption has played a significant role in shaping the theories about Brandon Swanson's disappearance. It's known that Brandon had been drinking earlier that evening at a gathering in Canby, Minnesota, before driving toward home. But what remains unclear is whether his alcohol consumption was significant enough to impair his judgment, leading to his disorientation and subsequent disappearance. Reports from the night suggest that while Brandon had consumed alcohol, he wasn't noticeably intoxicated. His friends who were with him at the gathering didn't believe he was impaired to the point where he would have difficulty driving, though it's possible he had more to drink than they realized. Brandon himself didn't seem overly concerned about his condition when he called his parents. In fact, throughout the entire 47-minute phone call, he sounded clear headed, calm, and in control, though frustrated with the situation. His parents never indicated that he seemed impaired or incoherent during the call. That being said, even small amounts of alcohol can affect one's sense of direction and decision making abilities, especially in stressful situations. It's possible that Brandon's disorientation was exacerbated by the alcohol, leading him to misjudge his location and the distance to nearby towns. The fact that he believed he was near Lind when he was actually miles away near Porter could be attributed in part to the effects of alcohol. However, it's important to note that Brandon's actions and words during the phone call don't align with someone who was severely intoxicated. He was able to hold a coherent conversation, explain his situation, and maintain a logical course of action by walking toward what he believed was safety. This suggests that while alcohol may have played a minor role in his disorientation, it likely wasn't the sole reason for his disappearance. The role of alcohol in Brandon's case remains a point of speculation, but without any clear evidence that he was impaired, it's difficult to say how much of a factor it truly was. What we do know is that his disappearance, while potentially influenced by alcohol, was far more complex than a simple case of intoxication leading to bad decisions. Something else happened to Brandon that night, something that remains unexplained to this day. Brandon Swanson's disappearance left his family devastated, but rather than allow themselves to be consumed by grief, his parents, Brian and Annette, channeled their pain into action. Their tireless efforts to find their son and keep his case in the public have been nothing short of remarkable. From the very beginning, they were determined to do whatever it took to bring Brandon home, or at the very least, to find out what had happened to him. For Brandon's parents, the emotional toll of the ordeal has been immense. Imagine the anguish of being on the phone with your child as they disappear into the night, powerless to help and not knowing what has happened to them. That moment has haunted them every day since. Yet, through it all, they have never given up. They've worked closely with law enforcement, participated in countless searches, and done everything in their power to ensure that Brandon's case is never forgotten. One of the most significant contributions the Swanson family has made is their advocacy for missing persons laws in Minnesota. After experiencing firsthand the delays in the initial search for Brandon, they campaigned for the creation of the Brandon's Law, which was enacted in 2009. This law requires law enforcement to take missing adult cases seriously from the outset, removing the previous assumption that adults have the right to go missing if they choose. It mandates immediate action, investigation, and a search when an adult is reported missing under suspicious or dangerous circumstances, as was the case with Brandon. Brandon's law has fundamentally changed how missing persons cases are handled in Minnesota, ensuring that families don't face the same frustrating delays that Brian and Annette encountered. It's a lasting legacy of their determination, born out of their love for their son and their desire to prevent other families from going through the same experience. But even as they've fought for change and helped countless others through their advocacy, Brandon's own case remains unsolved. The lack of closure is something they live with every day, and their fight to find answers continues because, for them, the search for Brandon is not just a campaign, it's a deeply personal, heartbreaking mission. Despite the tireless efforts of search teams, volunteers, and Brandon's family, there has been no trace of him since that fateful night in May 2008. No body has been recovered, no personal items like his phone, keys, or clothing have been found, nothing. The question that looms large over this case is, why hasn't Brandon been found after all these years? One of the leading theories is that Brandon may be in a hard to reach area, possibly hidden by the dense landscape or even submerged in water. The rural terrain around where he was last heard from is vast, with countless ditches, creeks, and fields that could conceal a person indefinitely. Despite extensive searches, it's possible that Brandon's remains have been overlooked or are in an area that search teams have been unable to access. The presence of the Yellow Medicine River adds another layer of complexity. If Brandon did fall into the river, his body could have been carried downstream, ending up in a place that is difficult or impossible to search thoroughly. While the river has been examined many times, it's not outside the realm of possibility that he is still in or near the water, concealed by natural elements like overgrowth or debris. However, the complete lack of physical evidence has led some to wonder whether something else might be at play. It's unusual for someone to disappear so completely without leaving a single trace. In most cases, even in difficult terrains, searchers eventually find something: footprints, clothing, or personal items. The fact that nothing has been found in Brandon's case has left investigators baffled. It raises the unsettling possibility that there are factors at play that haven't yet been considered. The lack of closure has been deeply painful for Brandon's family. They've had to live with the fact that, despite all efforts, they still don't know what happened to their son. Every search that ends without new information adds to their heartache, and with each passing year, the hope of finding answers diminishes. Yet, even without closure, the search continues, driven by a desire for resolution and justice. Brandon Swanson's disappearance is full of unexplained mysteries that continue to puzzle investigators and theorists alike. Perhaps the most confounding of these mysteries is the geographic location of his car. How did Brandon end up so far from where he believed he was? His confidence that he was near Lind, while actually being near Porter, remains one of the most perplexing aspects of the case. Was this simply a matter of disorientation, or was there something more at play that night? Another key mystery is the sudden loss of Brandon's scent, which search dogs had followed along a gravel road near the Yellow Medicine River. The trail seemed to vanish without explanation, leaving search teams with no clear direction to continue. The abrupt end of the scent has led to various theories, including the possibility that Brandon may have been picked up by someone, either intentionally or unintentionally. But if that were the case, why hasn't anyone come forward? And why has no other evidence been found to support this theory? The final, and perhaps most haunting mystery is Brandon's last words. Oh shit. What had he seen or experienced in that moment? Was it a sudden realization of danger, a fall into the river, a hidden obstacle, or an encounter with someone or something unexpected? Or was it simply an exclamation of frustration as he realized he was more lost than he thought? This brief, cryptic phrase has led to endless speculation, but without further evidence, it remains an open question. Could something truly unexpected have occurred that night? Is there an element to this case that no one has yet considered? Sometimes, in mysteries like these, the answer lies in the details that were overlooked or dismissed. As we continue to unravel the layers of this case, we are left wondering if the key to understanding Brandon's fate lies in one of these unsolved mysteries, or if the truth is something even more elusive, waiting to be uncovered in ways no one has imagined. As of now, Brandon Swanson's case remains unsolved. Over the years, it has transitioned into what can only be described as a cold case, a tragic reality for his family and the investigators who have worked so hard to find answers. But even though time has passed and leads have dried up, the case is still open, and investigators continue to hold out hope that something, even if small, could break the case wide open. At this point, there are no significant leads left to follow. The exhaustive searches, public appeals for information, and use of advanced technology have all failed to uncover any trace of Brandon. Law enforcement agencies have periodically revisited the case, re examining evidence and speaking with those who might have known something at the time of his disappearance, but nothing concrete has emerged. Despite this, there remains a persistent sense that the answers are out there hidden in the details, waiting to be discovered. In recent years, there has been growing interest in the use of new investigative technologies to aid in cold cases like Brandon's. For example, drones equipped with high resolution cameras and infrared sensors have the potential to search areas that might have been overlooked in previous ground searches. These drones can cover vast, hard to reach terrains, including dense vegetation, rivers, and hidden creeks where human searchers may not have been able to go. Additionally, new developments in sonar technology could allow for more precise searches of bodies of water, like the Yellow Medicine River, where some believe Brandon may have ended up. Another promising advancement is the use of artificial intelligence and data analysis tools to review case files, witness reports, and search patterns. These tools can identify patterns or inconsistencies that human investigators might have missed, providing fresh angles to explore. While no one knows for sure what the next step in the investigation will be, there is always hope that with time, technology, or a new piece of information, the case can be revived and finally solved. Brandon Swanson's disappearance has sparked a great deal of speculation, with three main theories emerging over the years: that his disappearance was the result of an accident, that foul play was involved, or that an unknown factor, a wild card, contributed to his vanishing. Each of these theories has its merits, and each has its weaknesses. The first theory, that Brandon's disappearance was an accident, is one of the most widely believed. According to this line of thinking, Brandon became disoriented after his car went off the road and began walking in the wrong direction. The dark, rural terrain, combined with the possibility that he may have consumed alcohol, likely contributed to his confusion. The most common hypothesis is that he may have accidentally fallen into the Yellow Medicine River, where he was swept away by the current. The strength of this theory lies in its simplicity. Many people have gotten lost and met tragic ends in similar circumstances. But the lack of physical evidence in or around the river casts doubt on this explanation. Extensive searches of the river have turned up nothing, leaving open the question of whether Brandon was ever near the water in the first place. The second theory, that foul play was involved, is more controversial. There's no direct evidence to suggest that Brandon encountered someone with ill intent, and the area where he disappeared was sparsely populated. However, foul play can't be completely ruled out. Some speculate that Brandon may have been picked up by someone, either intentionally or by chance, and that something went wrong after the phone call with his parents ended. This theory is harder to support because there are no signs of a struggle, no suspicious individuals reported in the area, and no credible witnesses who saw anything that night. The case's rural setting makes it unlikely that Brandon would have encountered anyone, but the eerie possibility of an unknown person lingers in the minds of those who still wonder. The third theory, that something else entirely happened to Brandon, is the most open ended. Could he have encountered an unforeseen hazard, like an abandoned well or a hidden ditch, that caused him to become injured or trapped? Could there be an unknown factor, such as a medical emergency or environmental hazard, that contributed to his disappearance? This theory is compelling because it accounts for the strangeness of Brandon's final words and the sudden loss of his scent. However, like the others, it lacks hard evidence to support it. Each of these theories has been explored in depth, but none of them have provided definitive answers. What happened to Brandon that night remains a haunting mystery, with each theory offering tantalizing clues but no resolution. Brandon Swanson's disappearance has left a deep, painful mark on his family, his community, and everyone who has followed the case over the years. The investigation, with all its twists, dead ends, and unexplained moments, stands as a heartbreaking reminder of how someone can vanish without a trace, leaving those left behind with only questions. The key points of the investigation, the phone call, the discovery of the car, the exhaustive searches, and the mysterious loss of his scent are etched into the memories of those who have worked so hard to find him. Yet, despite all these efforts, the case remains unsolved. The heartbreak of never knowing what happened to Brandon has taken an emotional toll on his parents, who have spent over a decade searching for answers, all while keeping his memory alive and advocating for better missing persons protocols. Through their advocacy, Brandon's disappearance has had a profound impact on how missing adult cases are handled in Minnesota thanks to Brandon's law. This law has ensured that no family will have to face the same frustrating delays in the search for a loved one, and that authorities will take swift action in cases where an adult goes missing under suspicious circumstances. In this way, Brandon's legacy has changed the lives of countless others, even as his own case remains unresolved. But despite the passage of time and the lack of answers, there is still hope. Hope that one day a new piece of information will surface. Hope that advancements in technology or investigative methods will finally uncover what happened that night. And most importantly, hope that Brandon's family will one day have the closure they so desperately need. Until then, the case of Brandon Swanson continues to stand as a tragic reminder of the unknown, a mystery still waiting to be solved, and a family still waiting for the answers they deserve.